The ground shook before I heard anything, and by the time the sound reached me, it was already too late to run. I was 16 years old, standing in the middle of a grain field on Kesset 9, when the trees at the edge of the property split apart like they had been peeled by a giant hand. I remember dropping the basket I was carrying. I remember the eggs breaking against the dirt. None of that mattered anymore, because something enormous was moving toward me, and every instinct in my body was screaming that I was about to die. My name is Mira Okafor, and this is the night my life stopped belonging to me. The creature that came out of the tree line did not look like anything from the colony textbooks. It was taller than our house, covered in plates of dark, shifting armor that seemed to drink in the moonlight instead of reflecting it. 6 limbs moved beneath that armor with a horrible fluid grace, and where its head should have been, there was instead a cluster of pale, glowing eyes that tracked me the way a hunter tracks something it has already decided to catch. I had heard stories about the Valkyr Reapers. Every child on every colony world had heard them. They were the monsters parents used to make you finish your chores, the shadow at the edge of every campfire story. Except those were supposed to be legends. The official records said the species had been wiped out generations ago, hunted into extinction by an alliance of frightened empires who could not stand the idea of something more dangerous than themselves. Legends do not walk out of forests and stare directly at you. I turned to run, and my knees buckled instead. Fear does that. It does not care about your plans. My whole body had decided, on its own, that running was pointless, and so I stood there, frozen, waiting for the end. The creature did not lunge. That was the strangest part. A predator that size, moving that fast, should have closed the distance in a heartbeat and finished things immediately. Instead, it stopped a few meters away, lowered itself onto its front limbs, and simply looked at me. The glow in its eyes shifted from a cold white to something warmer, something almost gold. And then it spoke inside my head. I do not have better words for it than that. There was no sound, no vibration in the air, nothing my ears could have caught, but a presence pressed into my mind, ancient and enormous, like an ocean deciding to introduce itself to a single drop of water. I heard no language, only impressions, only feeling, recognition, curiosity, something that felt almost like relief. I fell to my knees in the mud, not because anything had touched me, but because the sheer weight of that presence was too much to stand under. Tears ran down my face before I understood why I was crying. It was not sadness. It was not fear either, though fear was still there, tangled up with everything else. It was the feeling of being seen, completely and instantly, by something that had been looking for a very long time. Kesset 9 was a small colony, 300 families scattered across grain fields and mining stations at the far edge of settled space, chosen for its resources and its distance from anyone who might care what happened there. My parents, Daniel and Grace Okafor, had moved us out here when I was 7, chasing a land grant and a promise of a better life. We were nobody. We were not scientists, not soldiers, not diplomats. We grew wheat and raised livestock, and hoped the seasons stayed kind. None of that mattered to the thing kneeling in front of me now, treating me like the most important discovery in the galaxy. I do not know how long we stayed like that, facing each other in the ruined grain field, moonlight catching on both our faces. Long enough for my heartbeat to slow from a frantic hammer to something closer to normal. Long enough for the fear to soften into something I could almost call trust, even though every rational part of my mind screamed that trusting an apex predator was the last mistake I would ever make. Then, carefully, the creature extended one limb toward me. I should have run. I should have screamed for my father, who was somewhere back at the house, unaware that his daughter was kneeling in front of a living nightmare. Instead, I reached out and pressed my palm against the cool, smooth plate at the end of that limb. The moment we touched, something inside me changed forever. It was not painful. I want to be clear about that, because I know how this sounds, and I know what people assume when they hear the word bonded. There was no injury, no violation, nothing taken from me by force. It was more like a door opening somewhere deep inside my mind, a door I had never known was there, and on the other side of it stood this ancient, lonely intelligence, waiting to be let in. Images flooded through me. Not memories exactly, more like echoes of memories, fragments too old and too vast for my human mind to hold completely. I saw forests on worlds I did not recognize, burning under strange skies. I saw creatures like the one in front of me, dozens of them, hundreds, moving together across open plains, in something that looked almost like a dance. I saw those same creatures scattered and hunted, picked off one by fleets of ships that blotted out the stars, until only silence remained where a species used to be. And then I saw myself, small and frightened, standing in a grain field, and I understood, with a certainty that had no words attached to it, that I had just become the last hope of something the entire galaxy believed was already gone. I gasped and pulled my hand back, and the connection did not break. It simply settled, quieter now, into the back of my mind, like a second heartbeat I would carry for the rest of my life. "What are you?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer would not come in words I understood. Instead, an impression rose up inside me, gentle and searching, like the creature was trying to find a shape my mind could hold. A name formed, not spoken, but felt, syllables assembling themselves out of nothing until they settled into something I could actually say out loud. "Kalith," I said, testing the sound. The eyes in front of me brightened, just slightly, and I understood that I had gotten it right. Behind me, I heard the porch door slam open, and my father's voice cut through the night, sharp with panic. "Mira! Mira! Get away from that thing!" I turned to see him running toward us, an old hunting rifle in his hands, useless against something the size of a transport vehicle, but he was running anyway, because that is what fathers do when they think their child is in danger. I threw myself between him and Kalith without even thinking about it, both arms spread wide, my whole small body somehow feeling like enough of a barrier. "Dad, stop, he's not going to hurt me." "Mira, that is a Reaper. Do you understand what that is? Get behind me right now." I understood exactly what it was. I understood it better than he did, because I could feel the truth of it settling into my bones, patient and undeniable. "He chose me," I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I knew how impossible they sounded. I don't know how to explain it, but he chose me, and he's not going to hurt either of us. My father's hands were shaking on the rifle, but he did not fire, and Kalith did not move, and for a long, strange moment, the three of us simply stood there in the ruined field, waiting to see what would happen next. What happened next was nothing. Kalith lowered himself lower still, folding his enormous frame down until he was almost small enough to seem harmless, and the low, resonant hum that came from somewhere deep inside him was, I realized slowly, something like reassurance. My father lowered the rifle, though his eyes never left the creature. "Someone needs to explain this to me," he said, his voice unsteady, "right now." I did not have a full explanation to give him that night. I only had fragments, echoes of memory that were still settling into place inside my mind, and a strange, growing certainty that my life had just been rewritten in ways I could not yet understand. I told him what little I knew. I told him about the bond, about the presence now living quietly in the back of my thoughts, about the name that had formed itself without me choosing it. My mother came out onto the porch while I was still talking, and I watched her face shift from confusion to horror to something more complicated when she saw the way Kalith watched me, patient and protective, like a creature guarding the only thing left that mattered to him. We brought him back with us that night, or rather, he simply followed, moving through the darkness alongside me, with a silence that should not have been possible for something his size. My parents argued in low, frightened voices about what to do, about who to contact, about whether this was even something you were supposed to report. I barely heard them. I was too busy listening to the quiet hum of Kalith's presence in my mind, trying to understand what it meant to suddenly share your existence with something ancient and enormous and utterly alone. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake in my bed with the window open, watching Kalith settle into the field beside our house, his massive form curled in on itself, eyes dimmed to soft embers in the dark. Every few minutes I felt a gentle pulse from the bond, like he was checking that I was still there, still safe, still real. I did not know yet what the rest of the galaxy would think when they found out a Valkyr Reaper had returned from extinction and bonded itself to a human colonist's daughter. I did not know about the fear that discovery would ignite in a dozen alien governments, fear old enough to predate my grandparents, fear rooted in wars fought before humanity had even left its own solar system. I did not know that somewhere out among the stars, sensors were already beginning to register a signal they had hoped never to see again. All I knew, lying in my bed with my hand pressed against my chest, feeling the strange new rhythm of a bond I had never asked for, was that something enormous had just chosen me, and that nothing about my life was ever going to be small again. In the morning, the field outside our house looked different in the daylight. The trees Caliph had pushed through stood broken and bent, and the grass where we had first faced each other was flattened into a wide, unmistakable circle. My father walked the edge of it in silence, running his hand along a splintered branch, saying nothing, though I could see the questions building behind his eyes. Caliph was still there, unmoving, folded against the earth like a hill that had somehow grown overnight. When I stepped outside, his eyes opened immediately, tracking me the way they had the night before, and the bond between us pulsed warm and steady, like a held breath finally released. I walked toward him without hesitation this time. Whatever fear I should have felt had been replaced by something stranger and more powerful, a certainty that this creature belonged to me as much as I now belonged to him, that whatever happened next, we would face it together. I did not know yet how right that feeling would turn out to be, or how many people across 100 worlds were about to spend every resource they had, trying to make sure we never got the chance. I only knew that when I reached out and rested my hand against the cool plates of his side, something in the bond settled, deep and certain, and for the first time since the trees had split apart the night before, I finally stopped being afraid. That peace did not last long. Within hours, our modest farmhouse would become the center of attention for forces far beyond anything a small border colony was ever meant to face, and the quiet morning I stood in that field, feeling strangely safe beside a creature the galaxy called a nightmare, was the last quiet morning I would have for a very long time. The first thing I learned about sharing my mind with Caliph was that silence was never really silence anymore. Even when he was not pushing images or feelings toward me, I could sense him there, a low, steady presence at the edge of my thoughts, patient and watchful. It took me most of that first week to stop flinching every time I noticed it. My mother said it reminded her of learning to sleep through the sound of the wind turbines when we first moved to Kesset 9, how a noise that once kept you awake eventually became something your mind simply stopped questioning. The bond became like that. Not silence, but a sound I learned to live inside. My father wanted answers faster than either of us could give them. He spent that first week on the old colony transmitter, trying to reach anyone in the regional administration who might know what to do with a teenage girl who had somehow bonded with a species everyone believed extinct. Most of the responses were confused. A few were dismissive, assuming he was exaggerating or mistaken. One official actually laughed before hanging up. I did not blame them. If someone had told me a month earlier that Valkyr Reapers still existed, I would have laughed too. While my father chased answers from strangers, I found mine sitting quietly beside Caliph in the field behind our house, letting the bond settle a little more each day, learning to listen instead of simply feeling overwhelmed. It was slow work. The impressions he sent me were not like words. They were closer to memories with the edges worn soft, fragments of a life so long and so vast that my mind kept losing its grip on them, the way you lose your grip on a dream a few minutes after waking. But patterns began to emerge, and once they did, I could not stop seeing them. I saw forests, endless and ancient, stretching across a world with two suns. I saw creatures like Caliph moving through those forests, not alone, but in groups, communicating through some method I could not quite translate. Something between sound and thought and shared feeling. There was a rhythm to how they moved together, a kind of coordination that felt less like animal instinct and more like something closer to culture. I saw younger versions of that world burn. The images were never violent in the way I expected violence to look. There was no blood in the impressions Caliph sent me, no gore, nothing gratuitous. Instead, there was absence. Groups that used to move through the forest together grew smaller in each new memory. Voices that used to fill the space between the trees grew quieter. Entire generations vanished between one impression and the next, and I understood, without needing him to explain it in words, that I was watching the slow, deliberate end of a species. "Why did they do it?" I asked him one evening, sitting cross-legged in the grass, while he lay curled around me like a wall between me and the rest of the world. I did not expect an answer in words. I had stopped expecting that. What I got instead was fear. Not my fear, but his, filtered through the bond and settling into my chest like a stone. Fear that had been carried for longer than I could imagine. Fear that had outlived everyone who originally felt it. Fear that had somehow survived long enough to become a kind of inheritance. Slowly, over days of quiet impressions, I began to understand the shape of it. His species had once been the strongest presence in a wide stretch of the galaxy, not through conquest, but through sheer capability. They were faster, stronger, and more resilient than almost anything else that lived among the stars, and that alone had been enough to terrify every other civilization that encountered them. It did not matter that the Valkyr had rarely used that strength against anyone who did not threaten them first. It did not matter that they had built something that looked, in Calith's fractured memories, almost like peace among themselves. What mattered to the frightened empires around them was potential. What mattered was the possibility that one day, for one reason or another, the Valkyr might decide to use what they had. So they were hunted. Not in open declared conflict, but in something colder and more efficient. A slow campaign carried out over generations, designed less to defeat them and more to simply make sure they stopped existing. Calith's people had not started that war. They had only tried to survive it, and in the end, they had lost anyway, not because they were weak, but because the rest of the galaxy had decided their strength alone was reason enough to erase them. I sat with that knowledge for a long time, feeling it settle into the same place inside me where the bond lived, and something in me hardened that had never been hard before. I was 16 years old, and I had just learned that an entire species had been wiped from existence, not because of anything they had done, but because of what they might have become. "You're the only one left," I said quietly, not really a question, more a way of making the fact real by saying it out loud. The feeling that came back through the bond was not quite confirmation and not quite denial. It was something more complicated, a kind of uncertain hope tangled up with grief, so old it had lost its sharp edges and become something closer to a permanent ache. I understood, eventually, that Calith did not actually know if he was alone. He had been in some kind of dormancy for longer than I could properly measure, hidden away on a world far from anywhere the old hunters would think to look, waiting, though he could not fully explain to me what he had been waiting for. Until he found me, I asked him, one quiet afternoon while my mother worked in the garden and my father paced the porch with the transmitter pressed to his ear. Why me? Why a human girl on a small border colony, out of every living creature across 1,000 worlds? I expected the answer to be complicated, something rooted in ancient prophecy or cosmic significance, the kind of thing that would have made sense in the stories I grew up reading. The answer, when it finally settled into shape inside my mind, was simpler than that, and somehow more affecting because of it. He showed me an impression of stubbornness, not mine specifically, not yet, but the general shape of it, the way humans as a species seemed to refuse to accept the limits other civilizations assumed were natural. He showed me impressions gathered from whatever scattered fragments of galactic information had reached him in his long isolation. Humanity expanding into space, against predictions that said we would collapse under our own recklessness. Humanity surviving conflicts that other species assumed would end us. Humanity simply continuing to exist in places the wider galaxy had written off as impossible. And then, layered beneath all of that, he showed me something closer to home, an impression of me, small and afraid in a ruined field, choosing to stand between him and my father's rifle instead of running. Choosing, in the first terrifying moments of our meeting, to protect something I did not yet understand, simply because some instinct told me it deserved protecting. "That's it," I said, half laughing despite everything. "That's the whole reason. I didn't run." The feeling that came back was warm, almost amused, and beneath it, something that felt unmistakably like relief. I began to understand, slowly, that Calith had not chosen me because I was special in the way I had always imagined specialness to mean. He had chosen me because in the one moment that mattered most, I had acted the way his own people once had, protecting something vulnerable instead of turning away from it. And after generations spent hiding from a galaxy that valued only strength, he had been searching, consciously or not, for exactly that. The days settled into something like a rhythm after that. I split my time between farm chores and long, quiet hours beside Caliph, letting the bond deepen a little more with each passing day. My father eventually gave up trying to reach the regional administration by transmitter and started drafting a formal report instead, the kind meant to be filed through proper channels, though I could tell from the tight set of his jaw that he did not expect it to stay quiet for long. He was right not to expect that. It was my mother who noticed first, standing in the garden one evening as the sky over the eastern hills flickered with something that did not belong to any storm system we had ever tracked on Kesset 9, a shimmer, faint and strange, moving across the upper atmosphere like ripples spreading out from a stone dropped into still water. I felt it before I understood what it meant, a sudden tightening in the bond, Calith's presence sharpening from its usual calm into something alert and wary. He rose from where he had been resting in the field, all 6 limbs beneath him at once, eyes brightening from their soft gold back into the cold white I remembered from our first meeting. "What is it?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer. The impression that came back was not words, but I understood it anyway, clear and unmistakable, cutting through the quiet evening like a blade. "They know." I did not fully understand, in that moment, what those 2 words meant, or how quickly the quiet, careful world I had built around this new bond, in the span of a single week, was about to be torn apart. I only knew that the shimmer in the sky was not natural, that Calith's fear had returned in force, and that somewhere far beyond the fields of Kesset 9, something had just detected the impossible and had already begun deciding what to do about it. I stood there in the fading light, one hand resting against Calith's side, feeling his heartbeat and mine slowly falling into the same unsteady rhythm, and understood, with a certainty that settled into my bones like cold water, that whatever came next was not going to arrive quietly. 3 days after the shimmer crossed our sky, a stranger walked up our driveway wearing a uniform none of us recognized, and everything I thought I understood about our quiet life on Kesset 9 fell apart completely. I saw him before my father did, a tall, narrow figure moving up the dirt path with a kind of careful, deliberate calm that felt wrong for someone approaching a farmhouse at the edge of nowhere. Caliph felt my alarm before I even opened my mouth to call out, and his presence in my mind sharpened immediately, alert and coiled, though he stayed hidden behind the old grain silo at my silent, urgent request. I did not know yet who this stranger was, but some instinct told me it was better if he did not see what I was hiding. "Mr. Okafor," the man said when my father stepped off the porch to meet him, his voice smooth and practiced in a way that made my skin prickle. "My name is Corvin Ash. I represent the Regional Oversight Council. I believe you filed a report last week." My father's face went carefully blank, the same expression he used during difficult negotiations at the grain co-op. "I did. I wasn't expecting a personal visit. This isn't the kind of report that gets filed and forgotten," Ash said. His eyes moved past my father, scanning the property with a slow, deliberate sweep that lingered a moment too long on the flattened circle of grass at the edge of the field. "I'd like to speak with your daughter." I stepped forward before my father could answer for me, some stubborn part of me refusing to let a stranger decide how this conversation would go. "I'm right here." Ash's gaze settled on me, and for just a moment, something flickered behind his composed expression, something that looked almost like fear wearing the mask of professional curiosity. "Mira Okafor, 16 years old, no prior contact with any registered species, no history of unusual activity." He said it like he was reading from a file, though he held nothing in his hands. And yet, 7 days ago, sensors across 3 systems registered a biological signature that hasn't appeared in any database in over 200 years. I said nothing. Beside the silo, I felt Caliph go very still, watching, waiting. "I'm not here to hurt you," Ash continued, softer now, though the softness did not reach his eyes. "I'm here because a great many people are very frightened right now, and frightened people make dangerous decisions. I would like to understand what happened here before those decisions get made without your input." My father's hand found my shoulder, steady and protective. "Whatever you think you know, you should say it plainly. My daughter's dealt with enough uncertainty this week." Asha studied us both for a long moment, and then, quietly, he said the words that changed everything. We believe your daughter has bonded with a Valkyr Reaper, a species the Council spent generations ensuring was extinct. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced since the night Calith first walked out of the trees. My father's grip on my shoulder tightened. I did not deny it. There did not seem to be any point. "He's not dangerous," I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I heard how naive they sounded against the weight of everything Ash clearly already believed. "He didn't hurt anyone. He didn't hurt me." "I believe you," Ash said, and something in his tone told me he actually meant it. "But belief and policy are very different things, Miss Okafor. What you've done, whether you intended it or not, has triggered protocols that predate your government's existence. I need you to understand the scale of what's coming, because I do not think anyone back home has bothered to explain it to you." He told us then, standing in our driveway as the afternoon light slid toward evening, about the old wars. Not the sanitized version taught in colony schools, but the version carried in the oldest archives of a dozen alien governments. Wars fought so long ago that the species who started them had changed almost beyond recognition, but the fear those wars created had outlived every empire that took part in them. He told us about a species that had once moved through the galaxy with a kind of confidence nothing else could match, not through conquest, but through sheer, undeniable capability, and how that confidence alone had been enough to convince frightened neighbors that extinction was the only acceptable outcome. "They were hunted for 100 years, Ash said quietly. "Every remaining bonding site destroyed, every dormant nest located and eliminated. The Council believed the species was gone, completely gone, and now, out of nowhere, on a border colony no one has thought about in a decade, one appears, and it has bonded itself to a member of a species the galaxy barely trusts as it is." "You mean humans," my father said, his voice flat. "I mean humans," Ash confirmed. "A species that has expanded faster and more aggressively than any projection accounted for, that has already unsettled several older governments simply by existing the way you do. And now, apparently, a species capable of doing what no one else in recorded history has managed, bonding with a Reaper." He looked at me again, and this time the fear in his expression was impossible to hide. "Do you understand what that looks like from where I'm standing, Miss Okafor? It looks like the beginning of something the rest of the galaxy spent generations making sure could never happen again." I felt something cold settle in my chest, and beside the silo, Calith's presence pressed gently against my mind, steady and protective, as if he could sense exactly how frightened I had suddenly become. "So what happens now?" my father asked. Ash's answer came slower this time, more careful. "I would like to file a report that recommends observation rather than intervention. I believe, given time, this situation could be managed peacefully. But I am one voice on a council made up of representatives from a dozen governments, several of whom lost entire worlds during the old wars, and I do not believe they will share my patience." He paused, glancing once more at the flattened circle of grass in our field. "I would encourage you to prepare for the possibility that patience will not be an option much longer." He left before dusk, walking back down the driveway the same careful way he had arrived, and I watched his shuttle lift into the darkening sky until it vanished among the stars, feeling like something enormous had just shifted into motion, something I had no way of stopping. That night, unable to sleep, I sat outside with Calith and asked him, quietly, whether he had known this would happen, whether some part of him had understood, when he chose to reveal himself to me in that field, exactly what kind of storm his own survival would bring down on both our heads. The answer that came back through the bond was not comforting, but it was honest, and somehow that honesty meant more to me than comfort would have. He had known, he had understood, better than I could, the scale of the fear his existence would provoke. But the alternative, the quiet dormancy he had endured for longer than I could properly comprehend, waiting alone in the dark for a threat that might never fully pass, had become its own kind of unbearable. He had chosen me anyway, knowing the risk, because the alternative was an existence with no meaning at all. I understood, sitting there under a sky that suddenly felt full of unseen watchers, that I had not simply gained a bond with an extraordinary creature. I had inherited the weight of an old, unfinished war, one that had never really ended, only paused, waiting for exactly this kind of spark to begin again. Over the following days, the signs of that mobilization became impossible to ignore. Colony patrol drones that used to pass over our farm once a week began appearing daily, then twice daily, their sensors sweeping the fields in patterns too deliberate to be routine. My father's transmitter, once mostly silent, began receiving strange bursts of static at odd hours, the telltale signature, he explained grimly, of encrypted traffic being routed through channels far above anything a border colony administration should have access to. My mother stopped working in the garden altogether, choosing instead to stay close to the house, her eyes constantly drifting toward the horizon. I felt the tension building through the bond as well, Calith growing more watchful with each passing day, his rest periods shorter, his attention more constantly divided between me and the wider sky above us. He did not tell me, in words or impressions, exactly what he sensed coming. I do not think he needed to. I could feel it in the tightness of the bond itself. A held breath stretched thinner and thinner with every hour that passed. It was my mother who finally said out loud what all of us had been avoiding. We were sitting at the dinner table, the food mostly untouched, when she set down her fork and looked at each of us in turn. "They're not going to send another man in a nice uniform next time," she said quietly. "Are they?" Nobody answered her, because nobody needed to. We all understood, without needing it confirmed, that whatever careful patience Corvin Ash had promised to advocate for was already losing ground somewhere far above us, in rooms none of us would ever see, among representatives of governments old enough to remember exactly why they had feared the Valkyr in the first place. That night, I lay awake with my hand pressed against the wall beside my bed, feeling the faint vibration of Calith settling into the field outside, and I made myself a quiet promise, one I did not fully understand the weight of yet. Whatever came next, whatever fleet or army or ancient grudge the galaxy decided to send our way, I was not going to let them take him. Not after everything he had already lost. Not after he had chosen me, out of everyone he could have chosen, to be the one thing left in this galaxy worth protecting. I did not know yet how soon that promise would be tested, or how completely the quiet fields of Kesset 9 were about to become the center of a conflict older than my entire species. I only knew, lying there in the dark with the bond humming steady and warm at the edge of my mind, that the silence Corvin Ash had warned us about was already beginning to break. The sky over Kesset 9 tore open just after dawn, and by the time I made it outside, our quiet farm had become the center of an invasion. I counted the ships as they descended, though I lost track somewhere past a dozen, their hulls marked with the crests of governments I only half recognized from my father's old star charts. They came down in a wide ring around our property, engines scorching the outer edges of the grain fields, and within minutes, armored figures were spilling out of the landing ramps, in numbers that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. This was not Corvin Ash walking politely up our driveway. This was a coalition fleet, arriving with the unmistakable intention of ending something before it had the chance to properly begin. Calith was beside me before I even finished processing what I was seeing, his massive frame rising out of the field where he had been resting, eyes shifting instantly from soft gold to hard, cold white. Through the bond, I felt his fear tangle with something older and steadier, a kind of grim readiness that told me he had been expecting this moment for longer than he had let on. My father burst out of the house with my mother close behind him, both of them freezing at the sight of the ring of ships surrounding our farm. For a moment, none of us moved, none of us spoke, the four of us and the last living reaper in the galaxy, standing together in the flattened grass, while an army settled into position around us. A voice, amplified and distorted through some kind of broadcast system, rolled across the field. "Mira Okafor, this world is now under coalition authority. You will step away from the creature immediately." I felt my whole body go rigid. Beside me, Calith lowered himself slightly, not in submission, but in the coiled, ready posture of something preparing to defend the ground it stood on. I understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, that if I did not find a way to control what happened next, this field was about to become a battlefield. "Stay behind me," I told my parents, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. I did not wait to see if they obeyed. I stepped forward instead, putting myself between our house and the wall of armored figures now advancing across the field, one hand resting against Calith's side, feeling the deep, steady thrum of his presence beneath my palm. A single figure detached from the coalition line and approached alone, stopping a careful distance away. Their armor was heavier than the others, marked with insignia that suggested rank, and when they spoke again, it was without the distortion of the broadcast system, just a clear, cold voice carried across the open air.
My name is Commander Reth Vantos.
I lead this coalition detachment. I would prefer this resolve without further complication. The visor of the commander's helmet retracted, revealing sharp, alien features and eyes that carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had fought old wars and did not wish to fight them again. Hand over the creature, Miss Okafor. No one else needs to be harmed. He has a name, I said, my voice shaking despite my best effort to sound calm. It's Calith, and he's not a weapon you can just take from me. He is the last member of a species this coalition spent generations ensuring could never threaten anyone again, Vantos said, and for the first time, I heard something almost like regret beneath the authority in her voice. I understand this is not your fault. I understand you are young and frightened and did not ask for any of this. But the governments I represent lost entire worlds to his kind, and they will not accept the risk of that history repeating itself. Step aside. He hasn't hurt anyone, I said. Not me, not my family, not anyone on this colony. He's been alone for longer than I can even imagine, and the first thing he did when he found someone was protect them, not destroy them. If your governments are so afraid of what he might become, maybe you should ask yourselves what made his people that way in the first place. Something shifted in Vantos's expression, brief and quickly hidden, but I caught it anyway. Doubt. Somewhere beneath the armor and the authority, and the old inherited fear, there was a person capable of doubt, and for a moment, I let myself hope that might be enough. It was not. I have my orders, Vantos said quietly, and I have a fleet behind me that will follow them whether or not I agree with every part of what they require. Step aside, Miss Okafor. This is the only warning you will receive. I felt Calith's presence surge through the bond, not with anger, but with something closer to certainty. A quiet, unshakable decision settling into place beside my own. I understood, in that moment, that he was waiting for me. Not commanding, not overriding my choice, simply waiting to see what I would decide, ready to follow wherever that decision led. I thought about the fragments of memory he had shared with me, forests burning under strange skies, generations of his people vanishing between one impression and the next, not because they had done anything wrong, but because an entire galaxy had decided their existence alone was reason enough for extinction. I thought about the way he had chosen me, out of everyone he could have chosen, because in one terrified moment, I had refused to run from something that needed protecting. I was not going to become the reason that pattern repeated itself. No, I said, and my voice did not shake this time. Vantos's jaw tightened. Then you understand what happens next. I understand you're about to attack a girl, and the only friend she has left in this galaxy, over a fear that's older than either of us, I said. I understand that if you do this, you're proving exactly what everyone was always afraid his people would become. Except it's you doing it, not him. For a long moment, Vantos said nothing at all, and I let myself hope again that the words had landed somewhere they could actually change something. Then she raised one hand, and behind her, the coalition line shifted, weapons rising in a single coordinated motion that told me hope had run out of time. Fall back to defensive position, Vantos said into her comm, her voice tight. Non-lethal containment first, full engagement if containment fails. I felt my heart slam against my ribs, and beside me, Calith rose to his full height, every plate of armor along his frame shifting into position, eyes blazing white against the morning light. Through the bond, I felt his resolve settle over both of us like a second skin, steady and immovable. Whatever happens, I whispered to him, my hand still pressed against his side. We do this together. The feeling that came back was not fear anymore. It was something closer to gratitude, ancient and overwhelming. The feeling of a creature who had spent generations alone, finally standing beside someone willing to stand with him in return. Behind me, I heard my father's voice, rough with fear and fury in equal measure. Mira, get down, get behind the house. I did not move. I could not move, not with an entire coalition fleet advancing across our field, not with Calith rising beside me like a wall between our small, quiet life and everything the galaxy had decided to send against it. The first line of armored figures reached the edge of the flattened grass, weapons raised, and Commander Vantos's voice rang out one final time across the open field. "Last warning, Miss Okafor, stand down." I looked at the wall of soldiers, at the ships ringing our farm, at the sheer, overwhelming scale of everything the galaxy had decided a single bonded pair was worth mobilizing against, and felt something inside me shift from fear into something harder, something that had no room left for backing down. "No," I said again, louder this time, my voice carrying across the field with a strength I did not know I had. Vantos's hand dropped. The line surged forward, and beside me, Calith moved at last, faster than anything his size had any right to move, and the quiet, careful world I had spent 16 years building on Kesset 9 disappeared completely into the chaos of what came next. I had never seen anything move the way Calith moved once the coalition line broke into motion, and for the first few seconds, I do not think anyone on that field, myself included, fully understood what we were witnessing. The soldiers came forward with containment equipment first, just as Vantos had ordered, wide nets of shimmering energy, meant to wrap around a target and hold it in place, without causing lasting harm. 3 of those nets fired toward Calith in near-perfect unison, and I watched, my breath caught somewhere in my throat, as he simply was not where they expected him to be by the time they arrived. He moved sideways and low, all 6 limbs working together in a rhythm that looked less like an animal running, and more like water finding the fastest path down a hill. The nets struck empty ground, sparking uselessly against the flattened grass, and by the time the soldiers adjusted their aim, Calith was already among them. I want to be clear about what happened next, because I know how easily this kind of moment turns into something it was not. Calith did not tear through that line the way the old stories about his species always warned. He moved through the soldiers with a precision that felt almost surgical, striking joints and weapon systems instead of the people wearing the armor, knocking figures aside, instead of striking to cause lasting harm. Shields sparked and failed, weapons clattered from stunned hands, armored bodies were sent sprawling into the grass, disoriented and disabled but breathing, cursing, very much alive. It took me a moment to understand what I was actually seeing. He was not trying to destroy the coalition force in front of him. He was trying to make them stop, as efficiently and with as little lasting harm as possible, and the sheer control required to fight that way against dozens of armed soldiers left even Commander Vantos frozen in place for several long seconds, her expression shifting from professional readiness into something closer to disbelief. "Full engagement," she finally shouted into her comm, her voice cracking with something that was not quite fear yet, but was getting close. "Full engagement. Now. Now." The tone of the fight changed instantly. Where the first wave had come armed with containment tools meant to capture, the second wave came with weapons meant to stop a threat permanently. Heavier plasma rifles and mounted turrets swinging down from the landing ships, all of it aimed at the creature standing between me and an entire coalition fleet. I screamed his name, though I do not think he needed the warning. Through the bond, I felt him register the shift in threat level a half-second before I even opened my mouth, and his whole body changed shape in response, plates along his back rising and locking together into something closer to a shield than armor, a defense built by evolution against exactly this kind of overwhelming force. The first volley of plasma fire struck that shield and scattered harmlessly into the air, and I felt, through the bond, a flash of something I can only describe as ancient, weary confidence. This was not new to him. Somewhere in the depths of those fragmented memories he had shared with me, there had been battles like this one. Generations of his people standing against exactly this kind of overwhelming firepower, and surviving it, not because they enjoyed the fighting, but because their bodies had been built, over countless years of evolution, to endure precisely the kind of fear that created enemies like this. I understood, watching him weather that first volley without so much as a stumble, why an entire galaxy had once decided his species needed to be erased, not because they were cruel, not because they sought conquest, simply because they could survive almost anything thrown against them, and to frightened, less resilient civilizations, that alone had been enough to feel like an existential threat. The soldiers adjusted their formation, spreading wider, trying to surround him from multiple angles at once, and I felt a fresh wave of terror rise up inside me as I realized what that meant. He could weather a frontal assault. He could not weather being surrounded on every side by an enemy with unlimited numbers and unlimited firepower. Not forever. Not without eventually being worn down. "Calith," I called out, my voice raw. "Don't let them box you in." He heard me. I felt the impression land inside the bond. Gratitude and grim focus tangled together, and his movements shifted immediately, no longer holding a defensive position but breaking outward instead, using his speed to keep the coalition line off balance, never staying in one place long enough for their formation to fully close around him. I lost track of time during those next few minutes. I remember flashes of it, more than a continuous memory. Plasma fire lighting up the morning sky, the ground shaking under the combined weight of dozens of soldiers, scrambling to adjust their strategy against an opponent who refused to fight the way their training had prepared them for. I remember my father's arms wrapping around my mother, both of them pressed low against the side of our house, watching in horrified silence as everything they thought they understood about the universe rearranged itself in front of them. And I remember the moment everything changed. The moment Commander Vantos, watching her forces fail to contain a single creature despite every advantage of numbers and firepower, made the decision that would define the rest of this conflict. "Orbital support," she snapped into her comm, her composure finally cracking under the weight of what she was witnessing. "I need orbital support on this position immediately." I felt the blood drain from my face. Orbital support meant strike capability from the ships still waiting in the sky above us, weapons far beyond anything a ground force could carry, weapons that would not care about precision or containment or minimizing harm, weapons that, if they fired on our position, would not distinguish between Calith and everyone standing near him. Between Calith and me. Through the bond, I felt his focus shift instantly, no longer purely defensive, but something sharper, something that felt almost like desperation layered beneath his usual steady calm. He understood the threat as quickly as I did, and I felt him make a decision of his own, a decision that terrified me even as some deep instinct told me it was the only choice left. He needed to end this quickly, before that orbital strike had the chance to arrive. I watched him move differently after that, no longer simply evading and disabling, but pressing forward with a speed and intensity that made the remaining soldiers scatter back toward their landing ships, their formation collapsing entirely under the sheer overwhelming presence of something they had never actually trained to face. Vantos herself was forced backward, her weapon raised uselessly as Calith closed the distance between them, and for one horrifying moment, I thought I understood exactly how this was about to end. Generations of fear finally justified in the worst possible way. Instead, he stopped. Just short of her, close enough that she could not have raised her weapon in time even if she tried. He stopped completely, his massive frame towering over her, eyes blazing white, every plate of armor along his body still locked in full defensive posture. He did not strike. He simply stood there, close enough to end the confrontation entirely, and chose not to. Through the bond, I felt the reason settle into place inside my own mind, clear and unmistakable, meant as much for Vantos to somehow sense as for me to understand. He was not the thing they feared. He was choosing, in the middle of a battle that could have ended any number of ways, to prove that fact instead of confirming it. Vantos stood frozen beneath him, her breath coming hard and fast, her weapon still raised but her hand no longer steady enough to use it effectively. For a long, suspended moment, nobody moved, the entire battlefield holding its breath around the two of them. And then, from somewhere far above us, a new light appeared in the sky, cutting through the smoke and chaos with the unmistakable signature of an approaching vessel, far larger than anything already gathered around our farm, moving with the kind of speed that told me, even before I understood who it belonged to, that everything about this fight was about to change again. The ship that broke through the smoke over our farm was not like anything in the Coalition fleet, and I knew, the second I saw its silhouette against the morning sky, exactly who had come to answer the distress signal my father had been quietly transmitting since the first ships arrived. It was human. The vessel descended with a kind of blunt, deliberate confidence, engines roaring loud enough to rattle the last unbroken windows of our farmhouse, and painted along its hull in bold, unmistakable lettering, was a name I would remember for the rest of my life. The Halcyon Dawn. A human warship, drawn out to the edge of settled space by an emergency beacon, and whatever fragments of the diplomatic chaos had already reached Earth's outer defense networks. Commander Vantos, still frozen beneath Calith's towering frame, looked up at the descending ship with an expression that shifted rapidly from confusion to something closer to alarm. Around the field, what remained of her scattered coalition forces turned their attention skyward as well, weapons lowering slightly, as everyone tried to process this new, unexpected arrival. The Halcyon Dawn settled into a hover just above the tree line, close enough that I could feel the wind from its engines pressing against my back, and a voice rang out across the field, amplified and unmistakably human, carrying an authority that had nothing to do with old wars or ancient fear, and everything to do with simple, direct resolve. This is Captain Owen Bright of the Halcyon Dawn, representing the Terran Defense Fleet. We have received a distress signal from this colony and request immediate clarification of coalition intentions in this system. Vantos found her voice again, though it carried none of the certainty it had held earlier. Captain, this is a coalition security matter involving a confirmed extinction-level threat. I would ask that your vessel withdraw and allow this operation to proceed. My understanding, Bright's voice replied, cool and unhurried, is that your operation currently involves an armed assault against a colony populated by human civilians, including a minor, over a threat that has so far shown no aggression beyond defending itself against your forces. I am not inclined to withdraw. I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time since the coalition ships had first appeared. A small, fragile hope that maybe, somehow, this was not going to end the way I had feared it would, only minutes earlier. Beside me, though he remained close over Vantos, I felt Calith's tension ease slightly as well, the bond settling into something less desperate, more watchful. This is bigger than colonial law, Vantos said, though her voice had lost the edge of authority it carried when she first arrived. You do not understand the history behind this. The Valkyr Reapers were not simply dangerous. They represented an existential risk to every civilization that encountered them. I've read the history, Bright replied. I've also watched, over the last several minutes, footage from this engagement transmitted directly to my ship by the colonist who filed that distress signal. What I saw was a creature capable of ending your entire ground force in seconds, choosing instead to disable and contain rather than destroy. What I saw was restraint, Commander, not the extinction-level threat your briefing described. Vantos said nothing for a long moment, her gaze shifting between the ship hovering above us and the creature still standing close beside her, patient and unmoving, having already made his own choice clear without a single word needed. The ramp of the Halcyon Dawn descended, and Captain Bright himself walked down onto the field, flanked by a small escort of soldiers whose weapons remained lowered, a deliberate contrast to the coalition force still scattered and disorganized around us. He was not a large man, not physically imposing in the way Vantos or her soldiers were, but he carried himself with a calm, unshakable steadiness that immediately commanded a different kind of attention. He walked directly toward me, ignoring the tension still hanging thick in the air, and stopped a respectful distance away, his eyes moving briefly to Calith before settling on me. Miss Okafor, he said, his voice gentler now than it had been over the broadcast. Your father's message reached us 3 hours ago. I am sorry we weren't faster. You're here now, I said, my voice unsteady with everything I had just lived through. That's more than I expected from anyone. Bright's gaze moved to Calith again, longer this time, studying him with an expression that held more curiosity than fear. I understand you two are bonded. He chose me, I said. I didn't ask for any of this, but I'm not going to let them take him. Not after everything his people already lost. Bright nodded slowly, and then turned to face Commander Vantos directly, his posture shifting into something more formal, more deliberate. Commander, I am formally invoking Terran protective jurisdiction over this colony and its residents, human and bonded alike. Any further coalition action here will be treated as a direct act of aggression against a sovereign Terran interest. Vantos's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought the tension in the field might snap back into open conflict, this time between two forces far larger than the small engagement we had just survived. Then, slowly, Deliberately, she lowered her weapon fully, and behind her, the remaining coalition soldiers followed her lead. "You understand what you're doing," Vantos said quietly. "You understand what kind of precedent this sets." "I understand exactly what it sets," Bright replied. "It sets the precedent that when a coalition force decides to bring an army against a teenage girl, and the creature who chose to protect her, humanity is going to show up and ask some very uncomfortable questions about why." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy across the field, broken only by the low, steady hum of the Halcyon Dawn's engines still idling above us. I watched Vantos weigh her options, watched the exhaustion and old inherited fear behind her eyes finally give way to something closer to resignation. "This isn't over," she finally said, though the words carried none of the certainty they might have held an hour earlier. "The Council will not simply accept this outcome. Then the Council can bring their concerns through proper diplomatic channels," Bright replied evenly. "Not armed assault against a civilian colony. That is not a negotiation I am willing to have on a battlefield, Commander." I watched, still barely able to believe what I was seeing, as Vantos finally signaled her forces to withdraw, the scattered soldiers gathering their fallen equipment and retreating toward their landing ships, with none of the confident authority they had carried when they first descended on our farm. Within minutes, the coalition vessels that had ringed our property began lifting off one by one, engines scorching the already ruined field as they climbed back into the sky and vanished among the stars. I stood there in the sudden, overwhelming quiet that followed, my whole body shaking with the release of tension I had been carrying since dawn, and felt Calith's presence settle warm and steady against my mind, no longer braced for battle, simply grateful, simply relieved, simply there. Captain Bright approached again, his escort keeping a respectful distance, and studied both of us for a long, thoughtful moment. "This isn't finished," he said quietly, echoing Vantos's earlier warning, though his tone carried none of her hostility. "The coalition will regroup. They'll bring this to the wider diplomatic table, and there will be pressure, real pressure, to reconsider what happened here today." "I know," I said, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I was not as afraid of that pressure as I might have been only a week earlier. "But we're not facing it alone anymore, are we?" Bright's expression softened into something almost like a smile. "No, Miss Okafor, you're not." Behind him, the Halcyon Dawn hung steady in the morning sky, a solid, unmistakable symbol of exactly how much the equation had just changed, and beside me, Calith lowered his head until it rested gently against my shoulder, the bond between us settling into something I had not felt since the very first night he found me in that ruined field. Safety, fragile, uncertain, and hard-won, but safety all the same. I did not know yet how the wider galaxy would respond to what had happened on our small, quiet colony, or how many more battles, diplomatic and otherwise, still waited for us somewhere beyond the horizon. I only knew, standing there in the wreckage of our field with a human warship overhead, and an ancient, gentle predator resting against my shoulder, that whatever came next, we would not be facing it unprepared, and we would not be facing it alone. 3 months after the coalition fleet withdrew from Kesset 9, I stood in a room full of diplomats from a dozen different worlds and listened to strangers argue about whether I deserved to exist the way I did. The negotiations had moved off colony almost immediately, transferred to a neutral station orbiting one of the older trade worlds, a place chosen specifically because it belonged to no single government and answered to none of the old grudges that had nearly gotten me and Calith destroyed in our own front yard. I had expected, when Captain Bright first told me I would need to attend, that I would simply stand silently while adults decided my future for me. That was not what happened. The Terran delegation insisted I be heard directly, not summarized through a report or a translated statement, but present, in the room, allowed to speak for myself. I remember how strange that felt, walking into a chamber full of representatives whose governments had, only months earlier, sent an armed force to take Calith from me by force, and being asked, calmly and formally, to explain in my own words exactly what had happened and why. I told them everything. I told them about the night in the field, about the fragmented memories of a burning world Calith had shared with me, about generations of a species erased, not for anything they had done, but for what an frightened galaxy assumed they might one day become. I told them about the choice I made standing between him and Commander Vantos's forces, and the choice he made standing over her, without ending the fight in the way his ancient reputation would have predicted. He had every advantage, I told the assembled delegates, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, after months of preparation. He could have ended that engagement in seconds, and everyone in this room knows it. Instead, he chose restraint, over and over, even when restraint put both of us at greater risk. If you're truly afraid of what his species might become, I would ask you to look carefully at what he actually did, when given every opportunity to become the thing you feared. The chamber was quiet for a long moment after that, the kind of quiet that felt like it was actually being considered rather than simply endured. It was not a quick process. The coalition representatives, particularly those from worlds old enough to remember the original wars firsthand, argued fiercely for continued isolation measures, restrictions on where Caliph and I could travel, monitoring requirements that felt, even in their more reasonable forms, uncomfortably close to the fear that had nearly gotten us both destroyed. Captain Bright and the Terran delegation pushed back on almost every point, not out of blind loyalty, but because they had seen, firsthand, exactly what restraint under pressure actually looked like. I do not think the final agreement satisfied anyone completely, which Captain Bright later told me was usually a sign that a negotiation had actually worked. Caliph would remain bonded to me, recognized formally as neither weapon nor threat, but as exactly what he was, the surviving representative of a species entitled to whatever protection any other sentient life in the galaxy received. In exchange, both of us agreed to periodic contact with a newly formed oversight commission, not the frightened, reactive kind of monitoring the coalition had originally demanded, but something closer to genuine diplomatic relationship, built slowly, carefully, on the trust we had somehow managed to earn in the worst possible circumstances. Commander Vantos, surprisingly, became one of the quieter advocates for that middle path. I spoke with her once during a break in the proceedings, standing together near a viewport looking out over the trade station's busy docks, and she admitted, in a low, tired voice, that watching Caliph choose not to end her life on that field had shifted something in her that generations of inherited fear had never managed to move on its own. I spent my whole career believing your kind of restraint was impossible, she told me, glancing toward where Caliph rested nearby, patient and calm, even amid the crowded, unfamiliar station. I am not sure yet what to do with the fact that I was wrong. I did not have a perfect answer for her, only the truth, as I understood it. Maybe you don't have to know what to do with it right away. Maybe it's enough that you're willing to sit with being wrong, instead of pretending you weren't. She did not respond to that, but she did not argue either, and something about the quiet way she nodded told me the conversation had landed somewhere it needed to. By the time the formal agreements were finalized, word of what had happened on Kesset 9 had spread far beyond the negotiating chamber, carried across a dozen networks in versions that grew more dramatic with every retelling. Some accounts painted me as a reckless girl who had nearly started a war through sheer stubbornness. Others painted Caliph as a miracle, proof that the old fears about his species had been overstated all along. Neither version felt entirely true to what I had actually lived through, but I stopped trying to correct every retelling eventually, understanding that the story people needed to tell themselves mattered less than the reality Caliph and I were actually building together. That reality, in the months that followed, looked quieter than anyone watching from the outside probably expected. We returned to Kesset 9, to the same small farmhouse and the same fields, though the flattened circle of grass where Caliph and I first met never fully grew back the way it had been before, a permanent, visible reminder of the night everything changed. My parents adjusted, slowly, to a life that now included regular visits from diplomats and researchers, and, occasionally, curious representatives from worlds that had once considered Caliph's species an unspeakable threat, arriving cautiously to see for themselves what the bond between us actually looked like up close. I finished growing up in the shadow of something far larger than myself, and I will not pretend that shadow was always easy to live under. There were nights I resented the weight of it, the sense that my life no longer fully belonged to me, that every choice I made now carried consequences reaching far beyond my own small farm. But there were other nights, more of them as time went on, when I sat beside Caliph in the same field where we first met, feeling the quiet, steady hum of the bond between us, and understood that whatever I had lost of my old, simple life, I had gained something rarer in return. Not just a bond with an extraordinary creature, but a partnership built on the kind of trust the old frightened galaxy had never believed his species capable of earning. Captain Bright kept in occasional contact after the negotiations concluded, and it was during one of his visits, nearly a year after that first terrifying night, that he told me something I have carried with me ever since. "You should understand what you actually did out there," he said, standing with me at the edge of the field while Calith rested nearby, half asleep in the afternoon sun. "You didn't just save a creature the galaxy wanted gone. You proved that the oldest fear this part of the galaxy carries, the fear that strength always becomes cruelty given enough time, doesn't have to be true. That matters more than you probably realize yet." I thought about that a great deal in the months and years that followed, as the careful, uneasy peace we had built continued to hold, as more worlds slowly extended the kind of cautious trust toward Calith that had once seemed impossible. I thought about the burning forests in his oldest memories, the generations of his people who never got the chance to prove what he had proven, simply by choosing restraint on a battlefield he could have easily won outright. I understood, eventually, that the story people would tell about that day was never really going to be about a battle at all. It was going to be about the moment an old, exhausted fear finally met something willing to stand against it, without becoming the very thing it feared, and chose, against every prediction, to be better instead. I still live on Kesset 9, in the same farmhouse, beneath the same wide, quiet sky, though the sky itself feels different now, less like a boundary, and more like an open door. Calith rests beside me most evenings, in the same field where he first found me, and the bond between us has only grown steadier with time, no longer a source of fear for either of us, but something closer to home. The galaxy asked what would happen when its deadliest predator chose to protect something instead of destroying it, and eventually, slowly, painfully, it began to accept an answer none of the old fears had ever prepared it for. Not an ending, never really an ending, just the quiet, steady beginning of something the galaxy had spent generations convinced could never exist at all.